What I'm going to do today is point out that there were a lot of people involved, that it wasn't just me, I guarantee you that. But to begin with, I guess in lieu or in conjunction with talking about what our connections are, I've testified before the House of Representatives and the Congress on a number of occasions in support of the safety legislations, health legislations in the federal black lung bill. When the compensation provisions were introduced, I supported those, and so that's where I come from. I am a regular Department of Labor claims examiner, or not a claims examiner, but an examining physicians. I do independent medical evaluations, primarily for plaintiffs' attorneys, but also I've done some, mighty few I might say, for defense attorneys. So you may say that I am an advocate of coal miners' lung disease and compensation, and justifiable compensation, I might add. But you know, we think of the origin of the current program and the origin of the black lung movement. We kind of think of that as beginning in 1968, but that's far from the truth. It's been known for a couple of centuries that coal mine dust-induced disease is a serious problem. There were reports in the early 1800s about severe lung disease. There was the novel by Émile Zola, Germinal, about bad conditions in French mines. It was not at all absent in the United States as well. And about the turn of the century, things came to a little bit of a head. In 1902, under the sort of the guidance of John Mitchell, who was president of the United Mine Workers Union, the anthracite miners in eastern Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania went on strike. They went on strike for two purposes. They didn't strike specifically about the lung disease. They wanted shorter working hours, but primarily it was because it was such arduous work. But they wanted an increase in pay. The reason they wanted an increase in pay was to allow them to send their sons to school rather than bringing them in to the mining industry to help support the family. The typical beginning of a youngster, even as young as 6 to 8 years old, was to bring them in as what was called breaker boys. These were boys that sat on benches where the coal was dumped down chutes. Their job was to pick the slate or the rock from the coal. As you can see in this photo on the right, it's very dusty. Sometimes it was so dusty they'd have to use headlamps in order to see the rock. And that's a more posed group of them, but you can see it looks like something out of Dickens. At any rate, those problems were well known, and in the 80s, this was a little ditty that was sung or talked, describing the fact that what the usual circumstance was that the boys would come in, work on the breakers until they were strong enough to go to work in the mines, usually in their mid to late teens. They would work in the mines. When they became so impaired that they could no longer work in the hard job of mining, they were allowed to go back with the boys in the breakers. So it was was twice a boy and once a man. Some of the things that were said. At any rate, the miners' demands, of course, was a prolonged strike, and the coal industry people wanted to have President Roosevelt bring in the troops to break the strike. John Mitchell went to the president, Theodore Roosevelt, and these troops were not sent. Roosevelt agreed to form a commission to study the situation. So the commission gathered together various pieces of evidence. They had physicians who worked with miners, describing the severity of their conditions. They brought in miners themselves who were very disabled and made quite an impression on the group. The coal industry people, of course, brought in doctors who said there was no problem, and even were able to find a number of elderly coal miners who didn't have anything wrong with them. Now, the commission basically sided with the miners, and they did not. This didn't result in a shorter workday. It did result in some pay increase. However, it was not enough to support their families and allow their kids to go to school. So the net gain was very little. In a couple of years later, again under the guidance of the United Mine Workers and John Mitchell, an 8-hour day was established, as you know. And incidentally, the plight of the breaker boys was publicized, and eventually that led to some of the child labor laws that have been in effect. But at any rate, there were it was pretty well recognized that anthracite mining produced a lot of severe lung disease. They attributed this to the fact that there was high concentrations of silica, and they attributed the disease to silicosis. Now, the feeling was that while that was the case with anthracite mine, they felt that bituminous miners did not suffer from these problems because they were not subject to as much silica. But that wasn't the case, as you all know, and it was been recognized from early on in the last century that was the case. At any rate, one of the first people who paid attention to this and who was convinced that there was a problem was a man, Mr. J.J. Floyd, who was Forbes, who was a mining engineer who worked for the Bureau of Mines. He became convinced that miners were suffering from a good deal of lung disease, made the request that a study be done. So they brought in Dr. Merriweather, who was a public health physician, who came in, and the two of them performed studies in miners in Alabama and concluded that there was a significant problem with lung disease. They had critics who said, well, you just studied these miners in Alabama, and most of those were black, so that doesn't count. So they went to western Kentucky, where there was a much smaller concentration of African American miners, found the same studies there, the same abnormalities there. They then prepared the study for publication. Dr. Merriweather spent a whole year getting it ready. They then submitted it for potential publication. Since it was a Bureau of Mines sponsored study, it had to go first to the chief of Bureau of Mines. There it stayed. That study was never published. It was simply tabled by the chief of the Bureau of Mines. Dr. Merriweather and Mr. Forbes still preached every time they got the opportunity about the problem. But in the mid-40s, Dr. Lewis Friedman, who was a physician in Birmingham began to evaluate coal miners. He did radiographs, he did pulmonary function studies. He found a number of them who had impairment. He then even supported them by testifying before courts of law about their impairment, and was able to win some large settlements through the courts from the coal companies. Now, shortly thereafter, of course, the UMW Welfare and Retirement Fund was established, as you remember, following a long, bitter strike. The Welfare Fund then began to reimburse Dr. Friedman for evaluating the miners. Then he was allowed to continue the court cases, and he began to win very large numbers of cases, very high awards. This so alarmed the coal people that they decided that the best way to do it was to put into effect a workers' compensation law. So in 1951, Alabama was the first state to recognize coal workers' pneumoconiosis in its occupational lung disease schedule. So that was a great deal of progress. The Welfare and Retirement Fund built about 10 modern hospitals, mostly in Kentucky, a couple in West Virginia, and one in Virginia, and they established about 50 clinics throughout the coal areas. Didn't take them long to recognize that there was a problem of lung disease. And one particular member of the Welfare and Retirement Fund, Lauren E. Kerr. Lauren was an old public health doctor who had been recruited by the fund. He began really a campaign to educate doctors in the Appalachians, in the coal fields, about the problem of lung disease. He even brought in experts from Britain who had, of course, the British, as you know, had been way ahead of us for a long time. But he brought in those experts. They toured the coal fields with Dr. Kerr and spoke. Of course, they were bringing the message that the only problem was if you had complicated pneumoconiosis. But at any rate, Dr. Kerr was really a big mover in the whole process, educating physicians and people in the coal fields. Now, along about the early 60s, our Robert C. Byrd appropriated some money to do the Appalachian coal miners epidemiology study, to study disease in the Appalachians. And along with that program, there were research facilities that were set up in various places. Now, among the people that were working here were, first of all, Werner LaCour, who was a pathologist who was doing full Goff sections when I arrived here in 1962. Doctors Robert Hyatt, Albert Kiston, and Thomas Mahan performed a very good epidemiologic study of coal miners in Raleigh County, West Virginia. When I came here in 1962, I did not come here to do pulmonary medicine. I had finished my medicine training. It was wonderful. We could cure tuberculosis, but we couldn't do much of anything else. But my actual knowledge about coal miners' lung disease was this. When I was a medical student at the University of Utah, I had a coal miner from Rock Springs, Wyoming. I presented his case to my professor after I had done the history, physical examination, laboratory. And I showed the professor the man's x-ray. He took me in the hall and said, well, either you are a very poor history taker, or that man's a damn liar, because soft coal miners don't get silicosis. That was my education. But when I arrived, I found these other activities, these other people who were vigorously working on these programs. Then one of the physicians at the clinic asked me to start evaluating some of the miners, his patients. He said, I know these men have lung disease. He said, they don't have heart disease. He said, I know they have lung disease, they don't have heart disease. He said, I would send them to the workers' comp of the Silicosis Medical Board in Charleston, and they were told there was nothing wrong with them, they just had anxiety tension state. So I began to evaluate these people, and I certainly felt they were highly symptomatic, but the x-ray may not have shown very much, and the ordinary ventilatory studies were probably generally unremarkable. But I knew that where I'd been in Denver and San Antonio, that we had seen cases who were highly symptomatic with a good deal of respiratory symptoms who did not have significant airways obstruction, but when they were exercised, they were found to have exercise hypoxia. I simply persuaded the hospital to get me a blood gas analyzer, and we began to do arterial blood gas studies. And incidentally, in my training in 1959, I had been taught that the oxygen saturation rose very promptly after exercise, so we have always used indwelling arterial catheters. Of course, that's been subsequently supported by a number of medical tests. But at any rate, what we began to do was to do these exercise studies. And very promptly, we found some of these miners who had somewhat similar findings to those cases that we saw in Denver and San Antonio. They weren't characterized or classified much at that time, but we know now those were cases of interstitial pneumonias and interstitial fibrosis. At any rate, what we also found was that we found miners who were impaired who did not have complicated pneumoconiosis or PMF, and that you could find significant impairment in oxygen transfer with exercise, even absent ventilatory impairment. And a number of these people were sufficiently impaired that they could qualify for disability Social Security. I was persuaded to quit my job at Miners Hospital, and I took a job at the Appalachian Coal Miners Research Unit, which was set up by the Division of Occupational Health of the U.S. Public Health Service. We had the program set up there at Miners Hospital in Beckley, and the people in the Public Health Service were not particularly impressed with what I had to say, even when they had a report from a Dr. Sadoul from France who described the performance of exercise blood gases in his miners. He felt that was more reliable than ventilatory studies, but that was before there were any real standards set for ventilatory function testing. At any rate, I left the Public Health Service. The Welfare and Retirement Fund guaranteed our operation with the proviso that I testify before the Workers' Compensation, the Silicosis Medical Board, which I did on many occasions. At any rate, there was a good deal of evidence to support the fact that there was a big problem. Phil Ederline, who was an epidemiologist for the Public Health Service, published a report in 1964 talking about the excess mortality from respiratory disease among coal miners. And that was quite a dramatic thing. Our miners were dying more often than British miners were, and they'd become alarmed a good deal before we did. Lauren Kerr pointed out that there were, at that time he estimated 100,000 cases of pneumoconiosis. We now know that was a distinct underestimation. At any rate, by the time 1968 rolled around, there was a great deal of interest and concern about lung disease in coal miners. Our miners were very well aware of the problem. It was interesting that it was very difficult for most of our miners, or many of our miners, to work until they were 55 years of age, at which time they could take a pension. It was difficult to do so. This is quite in contrast to miners in the northern part of the state who regularly worked until they were 65. But that's just an example of the severity of the lung disease that was present in our area, which is part of the eastern Appalachian or bituminous areas. At any rate, there were a number of factors that brought this to bear. Of course, we've known about the increased mechanization with increased dust exposure. And then at that time, there was a lot of social ferment. There were anti-war movements, civil rights activities, a number of other factors that were put in. I must say these slides were, some of these slides were provided to me by the guy you heard about yesterday a little bit, namely Craig Robinson. Craig Robinson is one of the really undersung heroes of this whole movement, but he provided me with a number of these. But these are the factors that he felt were responsible for the atmosphere and the fervor that was taking place. But probably the triggering event was the 1968 UMW convention that was held in Denver, Colorado. And in response to inquiries from about 600 local unions throughout the country, Lauren Kerr was invited to speak to the miners about the convention, about the lung disease in the miners. Our miners from West Virginia were very much influenced by what Dr. Kerr had to say. They returned to West Virginia determined to bring about some changes in the workers' compensation law. They first of all, approached the United Mine Workers district offices. The district offices back in those days were almost always appointed by the International or the president, which at that time was Tony Boyle. There was never a very good relationship between the locals and the district people, and they were told this is none of your business, the International will take care of this, and they even forbid the miners from using union halls for calling meetings to discuss the thing with the potential or the candidates for delegates and senators from the legislature. At any rate, they began to call for meetings. They called meetings with various groups. They started to invite Dr. I.E. Buff. Now, Dr. Buff had become the chairman of West Virginia's Air Pollution Board. And as such, that gave him a platform to talk about one of his favorite subjects, namely coal miners' lung disease. So he had been speaking out about the lung disease. They began to invite Dr. Buff to come to their meetings, and later on a delegation of local presidents came to me and asked me if I would speak to them and for them about the lung disease, which I agreed to do. At any rate, things began. We had some relatively small meetings, and then this happened. The Mannington number 9 mine in 1968 blew up in northern West Virginia. A series of explosions and fires killed 78 miners, and they many of them are still entombed in that mine. That brought national attention to the whole problem of mine safety, and it further stimulated our miners to look not only about the safety issues, but also about the lung disease issue. And the result, there were many more large meetings. Craig Robinson and the other Vistas. Craig was a Vista who came here at the same time Senator Rockefeller came. At any rate, Craig was assigned to Beckley. He began working with a group of disenfranchised miners and widows, Disabled Miners and Widows Association. Those were miners who had various types of disability, who were no longer covered by UMW benefits. When the fund was first established, they had provisions to give, of course, pension benefits, medical benefits and pensions to disabled miners, widows, orphans, and provide medical coverage for all those people. But in the 50s, when the coal industry began to slump, they began to, instead of increasing the royalty on the coal, they simply began to remove various groups from the benefits. So there were a large number of these people. At any rate, Craig, the first time I saw Craig, he was speaking to a bunch of these disabled miners and widows, and what he was doing was asking them what they thought would be an ideal workers' compensation law. And Craig and another Vista named Rick Bank got together with Delegate Warren McGraw, who was a young delegate from Wyoming County, which is next to Raleigh. And the three of them got together and actually wrote a kind of a model bill. At any rate, Craig and the Vistas would set up these large rallies, and some of them were standing room only affairs in courthouses, schoolhouses, and a number of the locals defied the international in the district and held them in the union halls as well. But at any rate, I've already mentioned Dr. Buff. Dr. Buff was a very entertaining fellow. He and I, and later on, Howie Wells, Sonny Wells, was a pathologist who had come on board in the Public Health Service and had worked on one of the field teams, and he also worked with Dr. LaCour in the laboratory in Beckley. He had left the Public Health Service and was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania for a while. But he was the son-in-law of Congressman Harley Staggers from West Virginia. That kind of gave him an in into some of the congressional committees. He, in February of 1968, he had me and three of the coal miners that I had studied testify before one of the House subcommittees. This was before anything had really started on the Black Lung movement. At any rate, the three of us formed the Physicians Committee for Miners' Health and Safety, and this was we went around after the Vistas set up these meetings. We would go and speak. Now, Dr. Buff used to come into a meeting and he would say in his booming voice, "You all have black lung, you're all going to die." And that, of course, was, anyway, and Wells would take a piece of desiccated and inflated lung and would stand up and crumple the dust so that it would fall to the ground and say, "This is what's happening to your brother's lungs." So my job was try to put a little realism in it, and the miners listened to me and smiled, but I was not entertaining. At any rate, that went on. The miners, though, in the winter over New Year's of 1968-69, got together and formed the West Virginia Black Lung Association, which was rank and file coal miners that were doing this. And this was because they had gotten no support from the International. At any rate, among the other people that were very vital here was an attorney named Paul Kaufman, who had been a former state senator from West Virginia. The Black Lung Association engaged him to write a bill, a compensation bill. And of course, Congressman Heckler, who was actually kind of a maverick among our politicians, became very incensed after the Mannington mine blew up and became a strong advocate then for coal miners' safety and health. And he even campaigned with us on the state black lung compensation, the Black Lung Association proposals. At any rate, we had some of these very large meetings. There were many places that were standing room only. This is an example of a meeting that was held. In January of 1969, there was a rally of about 3,000 miners on a Sunday afternoon in Charleston. And following the meeting, there was a march of all the miners down from the Civic Center down to the Capitol to lobby down there for black lung provisions. And the Black Lung Association wanted a couple of three things. First of all, in West Virginia, coal workers' pneumoconiosis was not recognized as an occupational disease. Miners wanted that. Now you say, well, what difference does it matter if you call it silicosis or coal pneumoconiosis? So far as compensation was concerned, it didn't make any difference. But when a miner died of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, the claim was denied. And the pathologists used to make a diagnosis of silicosis, parentheses, so-called coal workers' pneumoconiosis, end parentheses. That got by for a while, but after that they said, well, this isn't silicosis, this is coal pneumoconiosis, not compensable. So you can see that makes a difference. Then they felt that instead of using the old first, second stage designation based on the X-ray, they felt that the compensation fee should be provided on the basis of pulmonary function studies. And they felt there should be a presumption clause, so that if you had a disabling lung disease, there was a presumption that it was due to your occupation. At any rate, there was a lot of opposition to this. Tony Boyle and the International Union were very much opposed to, first of all, including coal workers' pneumoconiosis in the designation, and first of all, going ahead with the other proposals that the Black Lung Association wanted. In fact, the day before the combined
judiciary hearings of the House and Senate, they sent Vice President George Titler with a group of what I would describe as goons to a meeting with the Black Lung Association officers, basically trying to dissuade them from proceeding with their proposals. Well, that did not dissuade the miners. At any rate, there was also opposition from the coal industry people. Among other things, they tried to discredit me by first sending out questionnaires to many of the world-renowned pulmonologists, occupational disease people, and asked them basically if I was crazy about what I said. And most of them said I was, but people like Margaret Becklake said, no, that doesn't sound unreasonable at all. So that didn't work. But later on, they gathered a group of international experts, including Dr. Heppelston from Britain, who was a renowned pathologist, Dr. Ulmer from Germany, who was a pulmonary and occupational specialist. They got Robert Hyatt, who was now at Mayo Clinic, Jane Adele from San Francisco. They invited Dr. Keith Morgan and myself. Keith Morgan was from ALOSH in Morgantown. I presented a series of cases, a summary of some cases we had studied. Dr. Morgan followed my presentation with another set of studies. They were entirely identical, and he even said that some of these people had been studied in Beckley. I'll guarantee you he would die before he'd admit that now. At any rate, when they summarized the report, the coal people had gotten Dr. Penman, wrote the summary of the case, and not a word was mentioned about gas exchange in that. At any rate, there were other groups. Some of the medical societies condemned us for all kinds of things, rabble-rousing basically, and saying that we put out this stuff even without having published anything, but that's not true because we had published the first paper in 1968. There were other people who were opposed to the whole program, and that's the case. At any rate, there was the combined hearings. There were three groups of so-called experts, if you will. There were those of us from the Black Lung Association, Dr. Wells and me, and Dr. LaCour from Beckley, who testified on behalf of the Black Lung Association. The coal industry people had two doctors from ALOSH, Drs. Lapp and Morgan, and Dr. Burns, who is a cardiologist from Huntington. And then the UNW had brought in a group of experts whom they assumed would put to rest the wild claims of the Black Lung Association. They chose and had Dr. Jethro Goff, who was the world-renowned pathologist from Britain, who, as a matter of fact, was the inventor of the Goff section, the full lung section. They brought in Eugene Pendergrass, who was the dean of radiographic evaluation of pneumoconiosis in the United States. And they brought in Leon Kander, who was at that time chief of medicine and physiology at University of Texas in San Antonio. Dr. Kander had previously been a chairman of Governor Scranton's occupational lung section in his state. At any rate, the three of us from the Black Lung Association presented our justification for the black lung demands. The people from ALOSH testified that, well, since only 4 to 5% of coal miners develop a disabling or relatively fatal lung disease, what's the problem, basically? And so, at any rate, then Dr. Goff got up and testified. He said, now, simple coal workers' pneumoconiosis may not kill me, but he said, I would be very resentful for being short of breath for the last years of my life. And then Dr. Pendergrass said, the x-ray is imperfect. And he gave examples, showed examples of pathology that showed pneumoconiosis, but the x-ray was negative, and so forth. Then Leon Kander stated that there was no real correlation between the radiographic abnormalities and pulmonary abnormalities. So we felt like this was a wonderful victory for us. And Leon, in fact, who I had known before, came to the motel room where we were staying. They had a rebroadcast of the hearings on TV. And he sat there and he said, we won. He was very elated. But the transcript of that hearing somehow mysteriously disappeared. And the bill that came out of that meeting, of that judiciary hearings, was more restrictive than the bill that miners were living under at the time. At any rate, that induced the largest coal mine strike in history over a health issue. The Black Lung Association, of course, did not call for or recommend a strike. But the miners were so agitated and upset about things that when there was an excuse to close the mines, they did so. Now, most of the books will say that miners from the East Gulf mine in Raleigh County went on strike because of wrongful discharge. And then I've talked to miners from Herndon mine in Wyoming County who maintained they first went out because the foreman had struck a miner, so they went out. But then they said, well, let's just shut the mines down and say it's over black lung. And they virtually closed all the mines in West Virginia before it was over. And the people that like Paul Kaufman and other allies in the legislature were attempting to amend that law to bring back in some of the proposals of the Black Lung Association. Congressman Heckler was at a rally in February 1969 in which there was, again, the Civic Center was completely filled with miners. Here's Ken Heckler with this big stick of baloney. The books say that he said this is for the medical profession, but he said this is for Tony Boyle. And at any rate, the miners again marched to the Capitol, again attempting to come in the Capitol. They had promises from the governor that he would sign any legislation, basically tell them to go back to work and I'll take care of it, which they obviously did not do. At any rate, right at the last seconds of the end of the session, they finally agreed to a number of the proposals that the Black Lung Association had wanted. They did get recognition of coal workers' pneumoconiosis as an occupational disease. They got a requirement for evaluation based on pulmonary function, And they got the presumption clause, which was a rebuttable presumption that if you had a disabling lung disease and worked 10 years or more in the mines, that it was related to coal mine dust exposure. And as a matter of fact, those provisions are still in existence in West Virginia's workers' comp system. At any rate, Congress at this time had taken up the problem because of the Mannington mines, took up the problem of safety issues. And there were proponents for putting in the problem of lung disease like Ken Heckler. But the coal industry people came along and said, oh, it's too soon. We have to do more research before we can talk about the lung disease. Again, this is in spite of what the British had been doing for years. Tony Boyle from the United Mine Workers Union came along and said, no, we can't do this. It's too soon. We need more research. So they had tabled the issue of lung disease until they saw West Virginia miners be willing to lose 3 weeks' pay over a lung disease issue. So they put it back in, and then Ken Heckler basically wrote and shepherded the bill through Congress. He gathered experts, got experts, people from the Bureau of Mines. He called in experts like Jethro Goff. He called in, he even paid the transportation and housing costs of disabled miners from his district and the widows from Mannington, and pushed the bill itself. And here again, the Black Lung Association showed its support by lobbying. This is on the steps of the Capitol in 1969. At any rate, Ken Heckler here is shown with a guy named Jock Yablonsky. Jock Yablonsky had been, I first met him in 1964 when I was in the Public Health Service. He had gone to Scranton, Governor Scranton in Pennsylvania in 1964, and persuaded Scranton to include coal workers' pneumoconiosis in Pennsylvania's occupational scheme. Now, Jock Yablonsky was one of the few elected presidents of the district. He was president of District 5 in western Pennsylvania. Because Tony Boyle had been so annoyed at his getting this placed in Pennsylvania's law, he actually removed Yablonsky from his elected position. He tried to remove him from a nonpartisan sort of a lobbying group that was associated with UMW, but Yablonsky sued and was reinstated in that. And as such, he spoke in favor of the federal black lung legislation. He was a great ally of Ken Heckler. At any rate, he was very supportive. He was very knowledgeable. At any rate, in 1969, this is some of the things that Ken Heckler did. And again, he worked tirelessly. If you wanted to speak to Ken at midnight, you'd pick up the phone and call his office, and he'd answer the phone because he was there working, I guess, nonstop during that period. At any rate, he managed to get it all through. Now, there were nobody disagreed with the proposals to tighten up safety measures. And as a matter of fact, the Nixon administration was fully in favor of not only the safety issues, but also the health issues with dust control. But then in the middle of the year, Congressman Philip Burton from San Francisco said you must include a compensation provision because, justifiably so, because so many of these miners have gone past their statute of limitations in their workers' compensation schemes. Some of them weren't covered by that, so he insisted that that be done. Now, again, Tony Boyle objected to that and said, no, that would ruin the whole thing. Nixon threatened to veto the bill because that provision was in there. However, he finally relented because there was a hint of a nationwide strike, kind of suggested by Ken Heckler a little bit. But at any rate, he kind of begrudgingly signed the bill. And so for the first time, we had not only a health standard for dust control, for dust exposure to coal miners, but we also got the first compensation provision, and which is why we're here today. It was because of that. Now, in mid-1969, Yablonsky challenged Boyle for leadership. Boyle had been very unpopular. In 1968, there was a strike against the contract that Boyle had signed. But he was very unpopular and basically wed to the coal industry. But Yablonsky challenged him, and I certainly supported him. At any rate, he was defeated in December 1969 in a what was subsequently found to be a very fraudulent election. But a week or two later, Yablonsky and his wife and daughter were murdered in their home in Pennsylvania. And eventually it was found that Tony Boyle had instigated the assassination. And at any rate, the Justice Department investigated that election and found that it was fraudulent. A new election was formed, and it was a supervised election, and Arnold Miller defeated Tony Boyle in that election and instituted the first real union-wide democracy with elected district officials, as well as the strong local union democracy. At any rate, of course, Mr. Boyle was arrested and eventually convicted. But after the 1969 Act was in place, things were not really smooth. The initial requirements for impairment or disability were extremely rigid. They were set up at the same standards as for disability Social Security, which you all know are about as severe as there is. In fact, I asked at a meeting one time, well, who set these standards? And Mr. Bork from the White House said, the President of the United States. And of course, that's what had happened. Well, but there were not very many claims approved. But again, miners and the Black Lung Association began to agitate. They even had rallies in front of Social Security offices. It was under the administration of the Social Security Administration. And there was even a couple of strikes over the problem. And so in 1972, Congress amended the bill. And what they did was to define disability as being your inability to perform your last regular coal mine job. They even put in a presumption clause, and that looked and certainly liberalized the requirements. Unfortunately for the integrity of the program. The Nixon administration's program, well, first of all, everybody expected it to be vetoed, but it was not vetoed. And in fact, the regulations that were put in effect were unbelievably liberal. In fact, I met with Bernie Popick and William Remmer, who were chief guys in the disability section, and we met in Charleston, and they asked me what I thought ought to be done. I told them, certain liberalizing the ventilatory functions and blood gas, and that was what I said. Then as we were leaving the meeting, they said, well, what if we just said that anybody who has X-ray evidence of pneumoconiosis automatically qualifies? And I said, well, that's going a lot further than I'd go. At any rate, that's exactly what they did. They said anybody who had an X-ray report that said they had pneumoconiosis automatically qualified. Then they said, if that's not the case, if you have a ventilatory impairment that meets these criteria, you will benefit. They set a one-size-fits-all spirometric standard, so that if you were an old man, you could be 100% healthy and still qualify for federal block lung benefits. Of course, they maintained the same rigid standards for arterial blood gas studies. At any rate, that ruined the credibility of the program without any doubt, because you would go to places and the store clerk would say, well, I don't know why so-and-so's getting his benefits. He's out and hunting every day and so forth and so forth. And here's this other guy that can't even walk and he's not getting his. So it was unfortunate. I felt that it was part of Nixon's re-election overkill. That's what I believe. At any rate, after in mid 70s, the Department of Labor took over the program from the Social Security Administration, and what they did was to just simply resume the same original rigid standards. So again, starting in 1976, there were efforts with Ken Heckler and others to amend the bill, and then finally in 1978 there were the 78 amendments that codified the disability standards, liberalized the blood gases a little bit, resumed the presumption clause, set up some other safeguards. For example, fixed it so that the minor didn't have to pay a lawyer a part of his benefits, which had been the case under the old standards with the Social Security Administration. Set up the Department of Labor's district offices, which have worked extremely well, in my opinion. A bureaucracy that does work, I guarantee you that. At any rate, so there was a great deal of progress made by those 78 amendments. But then in 1981, under the Reagan administration, they put back in the requirement for X-ray. They made some other changes. They decided that the states weren't going to be able to take over the thing, so it was still administered by the federal government. They set up the fact that there'd be a fund for uncovered minors or uncovered companies and so forth. They modified it and made some benefits. But it went back to the whole problem that minors had, namely the X-ray requirement was there, and it was very rigid. What would happen was the company could afford to get dozens of X-rays, and the coal miner couldn't afford to get dozens of X-rays. The coal company was allowed to get any number of studies or reports or opinions from anybody. They were experts. Coal miners could only get what he could afford. And so it was things were very stacked against the miner. For example, on the x-rays, the law judges would simply count up the score, and there are a lot more negative x-rays than positive x-rays, so that's it. And so at any rate, those were problems. There were a lot more people saying the man didn't have any problem than did say he had problems, so it made it very tough. Then, of course, at the end of the Clinton administration, the 2000 regulations came out, which basically defined legal pneumoconiosis, as you know, impairment related to coal mine deaths without the requirement for radiograph and so forth. And they also smoothed they evened the playing field a little by making it so that the coal company was able to get 2 expert opinions and 2 x-ray reports, and that was what the miner was allowed to get as well, which definitely changed your odds of getting your benefits. Then we all know that we have the 2010 Byrd amendments, and which have been a real blessing, and I must say, especially to the widows who previously had a terrible time. If a miner were drawing black lung benefits, she had to file a claim, and it was much harder for her to prove that her husband died of black lung or that it was a hastening factor, because again, you get all kinds of opinions. At any rate, so those were great things. At any rate, I put that on there because NIOSH had publicized the fact that there was a great deal of increase in black lung, and I know Lee told me that there's prospected to be even higher findings in workers' comp this year than there had been before. So, and that was the case. Well, since the mid-90s, NIOSH had been pushing for reduction in respirable dust levels. They wanted to go to 1 milligram, and that, of course, didn't move. When I made this slide, we hoped that it would be brought into being. Well, it finally, I guess we came to 1.5 milligrams just this year, if it hasn't been blocked or won't be blocked. The reason there is a black lung program is this quote from Alan Derrickson, incidentally, who wrote a very excellent history of coal mine black lung disease and struggles for it. And he attributed it basically to the democratic and vital energy in the local UMW local unions. Now, there's no question that the United Mine Workers Union has been an absolute strong and persistent advocate for coal miners' lung disease, black lung benefits, even though some of the leaders were not always so. I brought out the problems with Tony Boyle and the UMW because it did have an effect, did have an influence on what was happening and policies in general. Now, over the years, what's been so gratifying to me is to see, first of all, to see this group of people, always good people, who have one interest, and that is the well-being of coal miners. It's also been very encouraging to me to see all the good people that are now involved in this. Starting off, I guess, with Greg Wagner when he took over the program at NIOSH, and when he sort of turned loose his good people like Mike Atfield and Lee Petzonk and others. And then when we get the very, very expert Robert Cohen involved, now Cecile Rose, Lee Petzonk, just a wonderful group of people who are solidly in this program and who are advancing the knowledge of what's happening. In 1969, I publicly proclaimed that the disease was going to go away before we learned all about it. That's obviously not true, and we're still learning. So at any rate, that will conclude my presentation, except there are several references you might be interested in. That Death in the Mines at the bottom by Britt Hume. That was Britt Hume a long time before Fox News, I'll say that. I traveled a lot with Britt in those days. So. Anyway, if anybody has any comments or arguments, well, the coal miners are responsible for getting, because, you see 3,000 people marching down a road all with the same purpose. That gets your attention. And they didn't give up, and they still haven't given up. The UMW beat back an effort to liberalize dust sampling at one time. It's been a vital power